Hello, my friends. Welcome. Today is the 21st of August, 2024. I'm going to take you on a journey. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a tragic story, but one that we're experiencing now, the tragedy of it all. But it's going to be all right. What am I going to do? I'm going to try to explain to you how we got here to this, where we are now in society in the West. That most of us are wondering what happened to our culture, what happened to our civilization, what happened? It seemed to appear all of a sudden. And what can we do about it? And there is nothing that we see that we can actively do. We are powerless, we feel powerless. How is it that our politicians don't seem to listen to all that? Okay, and I'm going to take you back to the 16th century. This thing hasn't just appeared. No, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about Luther and the Reformation and all that when Christianity in the West was split into smithereens. I have covered that extensively. Well, not extensively, but I've covered that. I'm going to use, first of all, I have to tell you, as an introduction, I'm going to use a group of people, a society that is going by following them, how they started, and they rose in education, in prestige, and then they were dissolved and expelled from everywhere. And I'm going to talk about the Jesuits. Ooh, talking about the Jesuits in the Anglo world is like, the Inquisition pudding. Or I'm going to tell you how the whole thing started, how they came to be so successful in education and evangelization, and how almost suddenly they were expelled from every place. Even the Pope dissolved the society. They were brought back, but things had changed. And these people who had been there evangelizing, defending the Catholic world and the Catholic world view through education, were the ones who, at the beginning of the 20th century, they themselves became infiltrated, and they were not the only ones, but certainly a major part of what happened to the church. All the way up to the 1960s, what happened in the 1960s, those changes that actually were prior to the changes of the 1968 revolution, okay, and where we are now. And I'm going to do this because I know that in the Anglo world, to say it in some kind of way, the Jesuits, when you hear the word, you think of sophistry and casuistry and sort of deceitful Machiavellians and so on. You can't trust them, like Machiavelli, really. I'm going to, through their history, I'm going to tell you what happened to the West, okay? And the reason why I'm going to talk about them is because I am influenced by a Spanish historian. I'm sorry to come back to Spain, but this is what I know, to give examples. I don't know about Japan, I don't know about Sweden, okay? Spanish historian who wrote a book, which I partly translated with a grand title in 1875, at the age of 21, a great historian. He wrote a book, volumes and volumes of grand title, The History of the Heterodox of Spain. And what he's doing really is writing about the history of Spain through the Catholic Church in the case of Spain, because as he said, Spain without the Catholic Church, the history of Spain without the Catholic Church would be reduced to about 2.5 paragraphs kind of thing. Everything is connected. And he thought of writing that history through the eyes of those who had been anti-Catholic Church. In other words, from the very earliest heresies, the one bishop who stood out and he was an Arian, and the other one, and then during the Reformation, the ones who, not very many, but these were learned people, theologians, bishops, all that, who actually became very much anti-Catholic, and through them he explains the history of it all. And so I thought that this was a very good approach to, by following this society, what happened to the church, to Christendom, to Christianity, and where we are today, because they reflect that passage of time. Okay? Now, I am not a historian, I told you this, and certainly not an ecclesiastical historian, but I do read and listen to historians, especially in this particular case, Spanish historians. And I read their books and listen to their lectures on YouTube, their interviews and so on. And then I try to summarize the whole thing as much as I can and present it to you. And so this is nothing original in my part. I'm not a historian. I don't know history. I know a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of that, and can't put it all together. So I'm going to follow, and I will put his name down. All this I will put down on the description box. Okay, he's a very young and very traditional Spanish priest. Young, I mean he's probably, I don't know, 40, something like that, and he's part of this resistance to what is happening now. Okay, he never himself experienced the pre-Vatican Catholic world, which I certainly experienced myself. So he came to discover it. And he's very famous in Latin America and in Spain, and his writing and all kinds of things. His name is Gabriel Calvo Zarraute. Very Basque surname there, I suppose. I will put all that information in the description box. So I'm going to summarize all his, not all, but lectures and interviews and books and things. And he writes about many different subjects, but one of them is the history of the Jesuits and how everything started and how everything came apart. Before I do that, very, very harsh training is extremely interesting. Stay with me, you will not regret it, honestly, if you want to know what's going on today. The Jesuits had 14 years of formation. In the Catholic world, in the Catholic Church, you had the humble, lowly parish priest, diocesan priest, yes, but go back now to the 16th century, okay, and you find that those who felt that they had a vocation and wanting to be ordained, if they wanted something more, deeper, they would become part of a religious order. So you had the Dominicans and the Franciscans and the Benedictines, and each one with a different charism. Charism is, you know, if you want to put it rather profanely, a niche, okay? So the Franciscans would have poverty, and the Dominicans would have the preaching and the study of theology and so on, okay? Now, these people in these orders had a greater demand in their own personal lives. a greater sacrifice, greater renunciation, greater self-denial, mortification, penance, and so on. It was a consecrated life, as that life of the ordinary priest, but at a deeper, more specific level. So when a young man felt called to a life of greater dedication, or was looking for a harder, deeper life in terms of, giving his life to God, let's say, okay, was looking for a harsher life, he would not settle for being a local parish priest. And so you have, as I said, the Dominicans and the Franciscans and the Augustinians, and then later orders, perhaps the Redemptorists. The Redemptorists, just to give you an example, the Redemptorists in the 16th century were priests. Well, it was a religious order, and their charism was to pay ransom to the Muslims who would take Christian slaves and pay the ransom. So, for example, the great writer Cervantes of El Quijote, he fought at Lepanto, and then he was made a slave by pirates. And it was the Redemptorists who paid the ransom eventually. They would beg for alms, okay, and they would then pay the ransom. Those were the Redemptorists. Then you have the Capuchins, and so on. Later also the Carmelites, and so on. Okay. The ones we're going to excel in intellectual prowess and formation were the Dominicans, who had a great formation in the study of theology. They were preachers, but they dedicated themselves to the study of theology. The Jesuits would do that, but also the study of the humanities. And I'm going to go through the training from the first 2 years of the novitiate, very, very harsh, to 14 years until they are ordained priests. Let me see. So they were called in English is the Society of Jesus, hence Jesuits. But in Spanish it was founded by a Spaniard, a soldier, Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Loyola is a city in Spain, okay? And he was a soldier. And in the Spanish, we don't say society, we called it compañía, which means company, because he was going to train them along military lines of discipline and obedience. So instead of society, compañía would translate a little bit better as a brigade, something like that. It's a company, it's a regiment, that kind of, meaning. They would have a great intellectual formation, moral formation, very, very extensive. But also they were, through their training, provided with an iron will. It was a mastery of self, a mastery of control of the will, which was truly heroic. It is not an order, and this is crucial to know. And that is why it was a novelty at the time. 1548, they were founded. One of the things that they asked, that Saint Ignatius asked the Pope when they asked for the approval, was that they wouldn't necessarily have to follow the same, let's say, life discipline or life routine of other monastic orders. For example, other orders would always pray together at the end of the day. Ignatius wanted them to be free, not to have to come back the same day to do those things. I will explain, you will understand why. So they never had this same routine, daily routine as the other monastic orders. All the other orders, the Franciscans, the Capuchins, the Carmelites, the Dominicans, they came together at the end of the day to pray in community. They would pray the breviary and the canonical hours, the Holy Rosary, and so on. The Jesuits asked the Pope of the time, Paul IV, not to be different in that way. He didn't like them very much. He was, in any case, furiously anti-Spanish. And this was to be a very flourishing order, growing more and more, very, very fast, considered by all, respected, and with more influence. They had great theologians too. For example, Father Lainez, a disciple of great theologian, a disciple of Saint Ignatius himself. Many others. Okay, so one thing that was different was this exclusion of common prayer. Why? Because above all, they wanted to dedicate themselves to evangelization, external actions always. The Dominicans are the order of preachers. That is why they have the OP after their name, Ordium Predicatorum. Their vocation was to teach and to preach, and that is how, for example, Saint Domingo of Silos is another city in Spain, another town, Saint Dominic, you know him, was responding when he founded them to what he saw in the French, maybe in the south of France, really, the heresies there, along the Pyrenees, Languedoc, Provence, okay, the havoc that was being wrought in the 12th century by the Cathars and the Albigenses. The Jesuits would want to do that and more. So they wanted more freedom of movement to go wherever they needed to go. So off they went to the Americas, off they went to Japan and to India. You heard of St. Francis Xavier, yeah? Okay. So, the first order that wouldn't have this common prayer, excluded from that, I have to tell you, because there is some confusion about this, about words. A monastery is a building where monks live who are cloistered. A convent, which we normally now associate with nuns, was also a building where monks lived who were not cloistered. Okay? So, for example, cloistered in a monastery were the Benedictines, the Carthusians, the Cistercians, whereas in a convent, which was a building for religious who were not cloistered, for example, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Carmelites, the Capuchins, and so on. So the Jesuits did not want, from the very beginning, to be confined in this the same way that all the others were living, from the very beginning. Let me tell you how they were trained. 14 years. They had a novitiate of 2 years. extremely harsh. Extremely harsh. If you were going to drop out, it would be certainly during these 2 years. It was so harsh that you could have, very easily come to the conclusion that that was not for you. You would prefer another order, or you would just prefer to be an ordinary priest in a parish, or you would want to just go and not want to be a priest and be married and have children. Okay, but you were going to find out in these 2 years. There are orders who are much more demanding, for example, with penance. For example, the Carthusians, and after them the Cistercians. So others who are more demanding in the sense of poverty. Remember St. Francis, the Franciscans. The Jesuits' charism was obedience. Why? Because they were founded by a soldier, Ignatius of Loyola, who had served in the armies of the Emperor Charles V. Charles I of Spain, he was, besides emperor, he was also the King of Spain. Nephew of Philip II, yeah, of the Armada. Okay. And he was wounded in the region of Navarre against the French who had invaded, and was very badly wounded. Spilled his blood really in the city of Pamplona. Yeah, you know it, the running of the bulls there. So Ignatius, through all his recovery in bed, reading, was called to the priesthood. But he was essentially a military man. He thinks as a military man. He reasons as a military man. He programs and plans like a military man. And he structures a religious order, or religious society, as a military man. And so we have obedience, absolute obedience to your superiors. It's not going to be easy, but it's like a regiment, okay, or infantry, okay. So a regiment, from the old regiments of the Roman legions, who got their discipline from the Greek phalanges, the hoplites, and so on. Okay, so obedience crucial. And this obedience to your superior, as in times of war or whatever, okay, you have to follow your orders. It gives you better mobilization or flexibility to carry out maneuvers, as it were, at the time of battle. If you don't obey the orders of your superiors, then what happens to that army? You have one soldier going this way, the other going that way. Pretty soon you end up with an army like Pancho Villa or something. Okay, so no, you have to follow strict obedience to a hierarchy. Prompt martial obedience. The novitiate lasted 2 years. Let me tell you in what it consisted. It was extremely harsh, and you were tested. Just to give you an example, an anecdote, if you were to find a very, very old Jesuit nowadays, who remember the old ways, before they were infiltrated by the Freemasons and got into liberation theology and all that, he will tell you that, for example, the master of the novices will ask you, as a young novice, to sweep the stairs. Yes, but sweep the stairs from the bottom up, starting at the bottom, all the way to the top. What? That's nonsensical, right? You start sweeping stairs from the top all the way down to the bottom. That is common sense. They were not testing you on common sense. They were testing you on obedience in order to foment obedience. If you had a problem with this and that and the other thing, and it wasn't that's nonsense. So then they would call you, and they would, the master of novices would say, perhaps you should reconsider whether you are. This is your best vocation. Perhaps it should be some other order, or perhaps you should marry and have children. Okay. Not everyone could go along with that. So with the testing your obedience. All religious people, all religious in the Catholic Church, have those three vows: ordination, chastity, poverty, and obedience. The Jesuits had an extra one: obedience to the Roman Pontiff. See the general at the top. Everything that you're going to see is sort of structured along military lines. So anyway, 2 years. After those 2 years, you would have 3 years of studying the humanities. You would study philosophy. You would study, not theology yet, history, philosophy, all the humanities. You got a intellectual and a spiritual formation, instruction. Very, very intense. And then you would have 1 year where you were to go and teach they were very good at schools, opening up schools, and so you have to, for kids, and so you have to go there and teach for 1 year. So you had to learn also how to teach. And after that, you would come back and study theology for 4 years before you were ordained priest. Now, you most probably heard of the spiritual exercises. Yes, we call them now retreats. Perhaps you even went to one retreat. How long do they last? A weekend, 3 days, whatever, okay? Well, the instructions by Saint Ignatius of Loyola was a month. Actually, let me say 30 days. It's more accurate. That is what he wrote in the spiritual exercises. Every day you would have, as a minimum, 9 or 10 hours of prayer. Minimum. Doesn't mean active prayer. Meditation is also prayer. And during those days, you would meditate on all the truths of Christianity, the creation, redemption, sin, heaven, hell, and of course the life of Christ, of course the Gospels. In the first and the third week, the reason why I said 30 days and not a month is that a week, what they called a week, would not necessarily be always 7 days. It could be that in this particular week, which could be 5 days continuous, you would do this, and in the second week it would be 10 days, the second part. Okay, but in total it would be 30 days. And in the first and the third week, Saint Ignatius emphasizes more penance, mortification, fasting. The aim was to get this I dare not say just experience, because I don't want to make it sound terribly subjective, by this living experience interiorly, at the psychological level too, a very strong way of getting close, of finding God in that solitude, in that silence. I don't know whether you ever saw that film by Stanley Kubrick's. It's called Full Metal Jacket. Okay, Stanley Kubrick's, this priest, Father Gabriel, says that he thinks that he's probably insane or deranged even, but he says, but his movies are actually good, and he points to this particular movie, Full Metal Jacket, where you see the first part of the movie is about war and military and so on, and the first part is all about boot camp, the training. And the second part is about the war in Vietnam. Okay, so the point is that during those first 2 years of the novitiate, if you manage to get through them, and that is when you could very easily just say, no, drop out, I can't do it, okay? But if you were successful in going through them, that would almost assure you that whatever else happened in your life, you wouldn't break down. It was that harsh. So imagine the novitiate with three jumps, as it were, of 3 major tests. One was that, the spiritual exercises. The second one was, in the novitiate, was the pilgrimage. What was that? They would take you someplace and then tell you to go to this place of pilgrimage. Saint Ignatius himself had gone to the Holy Land and to many other places. You had to go there asking for alms, to experience poverty, destitution, basically. They would go in twos, like Jesus said to his apostles to go in twos. And they would beg for alms and beg for food, but only for one day, only food for one day. If some peasant gave you food for the rest of the journey or for tomorrow, you were supposed to refuse it. Why? You certainly could not accept money. Why would you not accept more food? It was in order to also train you morally to trust in divine providence. Your superiors would want you to experience this pilgrimage. After all, the church is a pilgrim here on earth, the militant church. Yes, we're all pilgrims in this world anyway. They wanted you to have this experience of absolute poverty, of absolute destitution. And they only had a small bag with them on their shoulder with the breviary, the book, the prayer book, a crucifix, one change of clothes, and a bar of soap, and perhaps even a small towel, I suppose. And they had to manage the best they could. It was the experience of making you strip away of all the things of the world, poverty, abandonment in the divine providence of God, extremely, very, very intense. A life of intense formation, if you can think about it in that way. Poverty, austerity, prayer, study. That was the second one. The third one, the third test, was service in hospitals. Hospitals in those days could be also hospitals for the insane, or even leprosy centers. You know, when you hear about these founders of religious orders or saints, they have names. For example, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, that is the town. Others, and I don't know exactly the reason why, at their ordination choose a name with a dedication to a saint, or John of the Angels or something like that. I don't know exactly how that works, but during this time there was one religious, Saint John of God, who had actually opened clinics for the poor and the vulnerable and the insane many times, and there were clinics throughout, and they were supposed to serve in those clinics. The test here was a test of charity, of abnegation. They were supposed to do actually the most humble tasks. So, to wash the patients and the old, and to feed the insane. I mean, it's not the worst of it, but I mean, you could be spat at the food that you were feeding, no problem. That was the least of it. Okay, so they would, but throughout all this time, they had to continue with the study in the humanities. They would study Greek and Latin, but not only the languages, they would also study the literature and philosophy in the languages. So by the time they got to certainly the study of theology, they would be fluent in those languages. Yes, I'm reading my notes here. Okay, all this, obviously, this formation, this kind of religious life collapsed, yes. Certainly, most certainly after Vatican II today. There are monasteries and the convents all practically collapsed. The ones that remain, a few nuns here and there. I just had a comment from a friend, that there are some nuns in Florence, Italy, that were being actually persecuted by the Vatican, asking them to leave. Obviously, they want the monastery. There are others in other places where they are sent to be retrained in modernism, I suppose, re-educated. Anyway, all these collapsed, plummeted. And Father Gabriel says practically there has been a cataract of closures of monasteries, convents. All that formation, all that traditional life of the religious that had been going on for absolute centuries, in practically all of them, collapsed because they were closed down, they were on purpose eliminated, stopped. One of the customs that actually I remember myself, I'm not a nun, but I remember it myself in my early years, being educated by nuns, was, for example, they would all go to the refectory to the dining room, and then one of the friars, the monks, or in this case the Jesuits, would go up onto a platform and would read while the rest ate. Okay? In most monasteries, they would read the Gospels or, the lives of saints. The Jesuits actually read not only that, of course, but also, for example, history. They would read the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. They would also read, of course, the history of the Church, the lives of the saints, but they would read Cicero and Strabo and Tacitus and Suetonius, the 12 Caesars and things like that. But these they would read in Latin or in Greek. And you can imagine, that you are there, with a spoon to your mouth or breaking a little bit of bread, and you're hearing it in Greek or French, and you're actually understanding it. You're able to follow it. And I say that I remember this not because I could read in Latin or Greek, but my nuns also used to have that tradition of being read to while they were eating, certainly during the first course. And they would pick one of us, those who they felt could read well. And I was one of them, and they chose me to go and read. Now, I couldn't see them because you couldn't go into their, what they call, community where they live. But I had a little sort of cubicle, and I was little, I was about 8 or something, and I had to get up and read, and I read. I don't remember what I read. Perhaps it was the lives of... I don't remember. But I remember one of them saying that they wanted, they like me to read to them because I didn't shout. What she said was, I didn't shout, but I was very good at projecting my voice. I didn't even know what it meant. But anyway, that custom was still there at the time. So remember, in these days, you, for example, if you were 18 years old, you started with your novitiate, and you would be ordained priest at the age of 32, whatever. Okay, so after the first 2 novitiate years, and you went through these 3 experiences that they called, okay, so the spiritual exercises, the pilgrimage, begging for alms, and the service in the hospitals, okay, you would have one whole month in silence and penance, another month in pilgrimage as a beggar. They did actually have to endure hunger and thirst and cold, and they would sleep wherever they could, up in the, in the open fields, which was dangerous at the time. And then the third one, the service in hospitals. And no, they were not paid. So, go back to these years. Ignatius is a military man, and these people had this very harsh training, very demanding. It's like a long military training, but this is what St. Ignatius wanted, to be physically and spiritually and intellectually, and this was their boot camp, as it were. They were founded in 1540. The New World had been discovered in 1492. The Franciscans had gone there earlier, and they started evangelizing. So when the Jesuits went there, they found already these orders functioning. But what the Jesuits did very well is that they founded schools. Why? in order to evangelize, you had to, how can I say this word without you stoning me? Civilize. To pacify. What I mean is to structure the culture, to create a culture, to elevate intellectually, to elevate morally, to elevate economically, to elevate politically, to elevate legally, to create a structure of society. Remember the military mind, okay? Not just structure society. This was not only done in the New World, they did it wherever they went. They did it in Japan, they did it in India, they did it with the barbarians in the north. They did it with the Vikings too, in exactly the same way. It was not a question of biological differences or biological racism or color. We have to get out of this looking at everything through our grid or our coordinates that we have now in the 21st century. It was not a question of being inferior. Okay, we all have a soul. We're all the same in the eyes of God, but they found, as you know, human sacrifices. They found that they didn't even know the will. Okay, the Vikings had the barbarians in the north had they also went through, actually the most civilized of them, it is said, were the Visigoths, because they were the more Romanized. Yeah. So the modus operandi, as it were, for evangelization was done in this way. What made the Jesuits very, very different and very, very special was this instrument designed by Saint Ignatius in his letters and the little book, the Constitution, that he wrote for the order. This was what was different, that this evangelization had to start at the top, not at the bottom of society. From the top down. It wasn't a question of being elitist. The poor were evangelized by everybody, the Franciscans. If you stood outside an inn with everyone getting drunk, I don't know whether I mentioned this, okay, it would be the Franciscan who would preach and the love of God and repent and so on. Their charism was towards the poor. The Jesuits was to educate and to morally form the rich. Why? Because they were the elite. Why? Because they were the powerful. Why? Because they were the ones who governed society. And they felt that unless the people at the very top were moral people, educated people, the rest of the society would suffer. You had to form, not only intellectually but morally form, the people at the top, otherwise the ones with power. Otherwise everything else in society breaks down. They will abuse the poor, of course. You have to have a moral grounding, and so they directed it and they recruited, as it were, from these top layers of the elite in society. And they were very successful, and that is one of the reasons why eventually they would be hated, and more about that a little bit later. I said this is this was new, but it was different. It wasn't new. If you think about it, it's common sense. And Saint Isidore of Seville in the 6th century is the method that he used to evangelize the Visigoth kings. The Visigoths from the north had invaded Spain. They were not Catholics. There was tremendous persecution and so on. The populace would not give up their faith. I mean, it had been there from the 1st century, and the martyrs and so on. So there were already you began to see very clearly different classes of society, the nobles and the aristocrats and the kings, all Visigoths at the top. Some of them were Arian, but most of them were not Christian. And then the rest of the population. That created a friction, obviously. So it was Saint Isidore who said, no, we have to go to the top and form those people, instruct those people, evangelize those people. Otherwise, the societies will always be at war. Okay. And he did that very successfully. The Visigoth king, Leopold, converted to Christianity and so on, and then his sons and so on. Okay. If this seems too far out, consider what is happening today. Okay, after Vatican II, vocations fell, faltered, but even with that, the people of Catholic countries, actually, even though the church was changing at this tremendous speed, being destroyed, really, the people still retained a cosmovision, a worldview of life. People knew what in the 60s and 70s, people knew what a marriage was. People knew what a man and a woman was. Yes. The ruling classes of those countries at the political level, at the media level, at the education level, began to, in these Catholic countries at any rate, become to be more and more anti-Christian, more and more infiltrated too, more and more anti-Christian, and so that comes down, yeah? And this is what has been happening, therefore, in the last 40 years, these changes, because the leadership has changed, their morals have changed, really for the last 70 years. So a process of continuous weakening and dissolving and stripping away the Catholic peoples of their faith, while sowing the poison of hatred of the church or anything religious. So the Jesuits then, to go back, had it very clear here, from the top to the bottom, from the best educated, the best prepared, let us say, the aristos in Greek, the aristocracy and the nobility, down to the demos, to the people. So in their schools, they were called colleges, in their schools they would seek always excellence in education and in training of these elites, who would then govern and guide the people, who would not necessarily have this kind of formation, intellectual or otherwise. So they would become collaborators, actually, in evangelization. In the Americas, for example, this is amazing with the missions. The first thing they did, they would create these schools. A school didn't have to be anything magnificent, but it could be a hut with palm trees or something. But they would start with music. That's how they started, teaching music. And the kids would come, and from indigenous villages, and the first thing that they would learn was music. And they would teach reading music before they taught them how to read. It was easier then when you were a child. So the first pedagogy was in music, it was musical, and then the rest. And then when they taught them to read, they taught them Latin. Why Latin? Because the Mass was in Latin, and the few responses that the people made were in Latin, and they had to know what it meant. And then they would teach them Spanish through the catechism. And if you're thinking automatically, oh, well, how about the languages? There were universities not very much later on, as you will hear I was just listening to a Mexican historian pointing out to the fact that very, very early on there were universities, schools and universities teaching the grammar of the Quechua language and other indigenous languages. Teaching them the grammar. Okay. But with the music, I want to show you something. They would teach them to sing. If I can give you an example of a motet, polyphony, for example. Yes, I don't know whether this is going to work very well. I chose one here. Now, forgive me if you don't hear it very clearly. I will put the link. It's only about 2 or 3 minutes. I will just, 1 minute. And I will put the link below. These are, for example, just to give you an example of the kind of music that the indigenous people, wherever they were, would be taught. Short motets. And this one is by Cristobal de Morales, 5th century, yes, in Toledo. But let me see if I can, I hope it works. I hope you can hear a little bit. Let me see. Okay, I don't know whether it worked. I hope it did. That was the kind of music that they would teach. Artistic formation. If you are for example, in Latin America, if you can still see churches from that period. And the amazing thing is that they are Baroque churches. Inside, the artistry, the paintings and everything else was done by the indigenous population. You can see it very clearly because the colors and the figures are actually, there are greens and reds and yellows, and which to an European it's a little bit it's different. It's different, but they were done by the indigenous people. So formation, instruction in art, very, very important. Another thing that the Jesuits did very well was to be able to select among themselves who was going to do what where. For example, in the last year of their Jesuitic formation, this long chain, the 2 years novitiate, the 3 years humanity, the magister maestro, teacher training, I suppose we call it today, and then 4 years of theology, continuously insisting, hammering deeper and deeper into that Greco-Latin humanities. Philosophy, literature, theater, music. 4 years of theology. But they were called, by the way, when they went to teach, they were called maestrillos. That is from magister, maestro, the diminutive, little teachers, little masters, I suppose. So that they would learn how to teach, and they would go to another Jesuit school to do their practice, I suppose. But before they were ordained priests in the last year, they would have a sort of a recap of all the things that they had studied, including the theology. But in the very last year, they would have to, before they became priests, before in military terms, they were to go into battle, as it were, into the world. They would be asked to write a letter to the superior, expressing why they felt that they would like to concentrate or be a specialist or go in this direction or the other. For example, if you were an intellectual, then you were naturally, so then it would be better for you to be a teacher, a professor, investigator, and so on. If you were more of an empathetic kind of personality, perhaps you wanted to go to the missions. India, Japan, St. Francis Xavier there, so they were very good through all these years of study at selecting and knowing who was good for what. So they excelled at actually what they did in this specific ministry or in the other. That's again pretty much, if you follow the military comparison, you are a sniper, or you are in the artillery, or you are an instructor, or you are a quartermaster, or you are in intelligence, or whatever it might be. Same structure. So anyway, eventually they actually earn a certain prestige in education. So much so that when they were expelled from everywhere and dissolved, actually the people, as I said at the very beginning, were asking why. The next thing to think about is that their recruits, so to say, since we talk about military terms, also came from the nobility and from the military, the top of the structure. Look, you were, let me put it all together if I may, you were a young man who went to a Jesuit school, and you wanted to become a Jesuit yourself. And you came from a very well-to-do family. You had servants. You were like a king in your castle, And you wanted to actually become a Jesuit. first of all, you're going to discover this very, very harsh life of obedience. That's going to be very difficult because you're used to doing whatever you want, really, in your house. You're surrounded by servants. And then you are sent to beg in the streets for alms. Harsh and austere life, a life in poverty, no luxuries now. And then you are sent, to live among the poorest of the poor, or to serve in hospitals or wherever. But, coming from this background, that is going to shield you in a way. Let me tell you what I mean. You already know what it's like to be at the top. You know that life. You have experienced it. You have lived it. Okay? And you have now rejected that life. You left your home and your comforts, and you live in this very austere world, in this very austere way. And that shields you, psychologically also. This is what I mean. When you come from the poor, from a humble background, I say this from someone who comes from the poor, which I understand the psychology of poverty anyway. But think about our politicians. Let's expand this a little bit more, not just to the religious life, but say nowadays to the political life. It is very possible that you find that those of very humble origins are actually the ones who want to follow the elites, who want to imitate the elites, those in the upper echelons of society. Its human nature is kind of natural, because envy is too strong a word. It's kind of natural. You want to have and you want to experience what you never have. So you look up at them and you want to be like them. Be careful, because it's very, very easily to have the temptation of becoming corrupted then, of forgetting where you come from or what you're about to, or what you're supposed to do. But it is a real temptation when you come from the bottom and suddenly you are in this club and you want to be like them. You might even imitate their accent or pretend to be one of them. And you might not even be aware when they are smiling and ridiculing you, but it is a temptation. You want to experience that you never have. In a way, you might even be a little bit ashamed, and you might want to cover. Yeah. This is possible, and this happens. And we have to understand it is a temptation. It's an attraction, yeah. But this is what I mean. A person who comes from the upper classes, who's used to that, who doesn't have, he has lived that life. He doesn't have to imitate anybody. He is one of them. Doesn't have to imitate anybody, emulate anybody, or change your accent. You are part of that clique, okay? But you have renounced that. And you had said goodbye to all that. You know what it is like. You have lived it. And then, as I said, you renounced it. Remember, you did renounce it. You were there for a year begging for alms. Of course, perhaps you will always feel more comfortable with that clique and that elite among your peers. But you see, you know what that life is, and you know that you have left it. You don't need to imitate them. So you don't feel an attraction for it, a dependence. Whereas you might, if you come from humble beginnings, you're more likely, without moral formation, more likely to want to be like them. So the temptation is harder. You have to fight harder not to fall into that. Again, into that temptation. Because it's very easy also for you then to want to become part of the elite and to be a little bit elitist yourself. Many Jesuits, actually this is a historical proven fact, psychologically, they came from that elite and from the military households. So, you are the son of a military man, you see your father in uniform, you see people, you see a certain discipline around you. To begin with, perhaps you didn't find it, perhaps you found it as a little bit of an extension of that life, that discipline that was demanded of you. Although this is in a religious way, it's different. But anyway. In any case, that view, that worldview, that entire application of these principles, the Jesuit education, that method in their schools had great success. In the Americas had great success. That is not to say that the other orders didn't. The Franciscans were there and so on. But the Jesuits, by choosing to evangelize the elite, they were thinking long term. Yeah, not just this individual person conversion and so on, but long term, the leaders, the ones who were going to become the leaders of the people in their own countries, effective leaders. Okay, so what happened? We got to a point where they have achieved tremendous success with all these things that I've been talking about. Great prestige, great education, great formation, great schools, and then they're expelled from everywhere. Why? What happened? Not only expelled from everywhere, dissolved by the Pope himself. So this is where I'm going to end. And in 1767, their expulsion from everywhere. And so in the next video, I'm going to deal with, fasten your seatbelts, because I'm going to deal with the next 3 centuries and the tragedy that happened. And I will, I'm sure, end up in a very hopeful note in any way. Anyway, so I'll see you in the next video. Please subscribe, like, share. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.